Tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mihi, tangata whenua, me tangata tariti o Aotearoa. Tēnā koutou.
Kei te mihi, ki ngā mana whenua o te whanganui a Tara, taku kainga mahi. Nā mihi nui ki ngā kai kōrero rā tōru. And for those that haven't met me, ko wai au, ko Robyn Bailey au, he Pākehā aho, he kai arotaki aho I te Alan me Clarke, tēnā tātou katoa. So day 3 is drawing our last day, drawing together the threads over the last 2 days. Day 1, where we explored the value of and what this mahi, this work involves. From yesterday, we heard about what matters in terms of relationships, addressing tensions and power sharing. Today, our final session turns the focus and the gaze onto government, asking what is our collective role in growing the conditions for these ways of working. I'd like to put an offering into the beginning of this day. My offerings to those of us who are non-Indigenous or not from the communities we work in. And I'm drawing on work of Penny, who's one of our hosts, and her colleagues Jamie Gamble, Kate McKeegan, and Sue West, who said in their blog, for those of us who are non-Indigenous or not from the communities we work in, if we are to have any hope of engaging authentically in a trusted relationship, we have to begin by acknowledging our own power and privilege and our own history in relation to those we work among and with. Only when we are truly prepared to fundamentally shift the power of who gets to decide, then we are in a place to begin a new kind of relationship, where shared values can be explored in different ways of knowing, being, and doing, can be embedded, privileged, centered, and integrated. A colleague was recently challenged me when I was talking about systems as an abstract thing, as an out there thing, saying that she saw systems as being about people. And reflecting on that, yes, I thought why systems include structures, cultures, relationships, norms, etc. Ultimately, it's people, it's us who are leading, enacting, and participating in the systems. So mihi to you all who are exploring and working on a daily basis in big and small ways to disrupt, orientate, create supportive conditions for new ways of being, doing, and knowing. And ngā mihi nui ki a koe Shenagh and IPANZ for your foresight and your courage to create the opportunity for these conversations. Thank you very much for this experience. So yesterday, reflecting on some highlights from yesterday, the group got together and pulled these out. So thank you very much for all your offerings into our Slido and into our chat. The offerings that we reflected on last night and this morning, tika, pono, and aroha. Meet people first, not as agencies. The challenges of time, this way of being takes time, and we are sitting in the pressure often of time, budgets, and cycle. However, this mahi takes time. We need authorization. It is really hard to predefine co-design, and that's just so not what co-design's about. Yet we are held accountable for the way in which it develops and emerges, because we don't know the outcome in advance. So we need an authorizing environment. There's been a lot of discussion around the complexities between serving the minister and serving whānau. We must understand each other's language. There was a call to remove the jargon, particularly if we were to create a space where we can build relationships. And then all of us, or many of us, will have the challenge of initiating difficult conversations when we step back into our agencies. Someone spoke about, how do I influence my colleagues to step back from holding control and to be comfortable with uncertainty? And lastly, be prepared to be vulnerable. If we are to have a shared kaupapa, we can work through it, call each other out and keep going. So today 3 is a gaze on government. Our program includes a presentation, a discussion, looking at lessons, live lessons from Uptempo, an innovative collaboration for Pasifika prosperity, and Penny will be introducing our new guests for that session shortly. We'll continue with time to reflect, discuss in breakouts, and then we'll come back to a Q&A with Anna Jane and Leilani. And after a break, we'll be moving into a panel discussion about preparing the conditions for working differently together. From two senior people who are working within government, and one who has been undertaking a PhD in studying in this space. So before we go into our first session, we'd like you to now reflect, take 1 to 2 minutes to consider how you and your team's way of being, knowing and doing set the conditions for working together in relationship to share power and address tensions. Thank you all. I'm really looking forward to the kōrero today. Penny will bring us backwards after this 1 to 2 minutes for the first session.
Kia ora, everybody. Thank you so much, Robyn, for opening for us and landing us in the kaupapa of our third day together, our last day. I'll just want to thank everyone, acknowledge that it's Friday morning, which has lots of good things about it, and it also means people's minds are full. Brooke just said to us before we came on this call to take a deep breath, and I'd just like to invite everybody else to do that too, because I certainly need sometimes just to pause. Quite often Lee's main message to me is, could you just breathe while you're trying to talk to people? So if everyone takes the opportunity to just have a breath and settle into our last couple of hours together, which has just been a real privilege to get to this journey and to share these last conversations with you this morning. I just feel so privileged and excited that in Aotearoa amongst us, we just have so much amazing mahi and knowledge and power and stories to share. And we only heard, you know, from 4 or 5, 6 of those in the last couple of days, but they've all just been so, from my perspective, profound and deep, and we're going to continue that in our next conversation. So I think we should all feel so great about the fact that within our own spaces and ways of working, there's so much richness to draw on. We don't need to go overseas to do it. Not that we shouldn't look at great stuff happening overseas as well, but there's so much mahi here, and we could only touch on some of it in these last couple of days, but it's my absolute privilege and pleasure to introduce our next couple of people who are going to share their journeys with us, who just continue what we've heard over the last 2 days about really amazing mahi. The 2 practitioners, Leilani and Anna Jane at the Southern Initiative, so one of my colleagues, and Leilani Tamu at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, working on what is a long-term, deeply change-orientated initiative that really reaches right across government and right into different spaces of community and families. And so I'm going to let them share their conversation, but it really is one of the most, I think, I don't want to use the word powerful too much and like put too much pressure on them, but the example of the ways they're engaging with the things that have come up over the last couple of days is just really significant across all the different layers of government. And so they're going to be able to talk to us about the different ways in which we can be influencing and engaging with power constructs and what happens behind the scenes and what that feels like. And also be they're just deeply inspirational. So I'm just going to hand over to Leilani and Anna Jane, who are going to share with us the journey that they're on, and that we can be supporting in them in, and then there'll be time to just decompress a little bit of what they share, and then we'll come back and have some time for some more questions with them. So yeah, my greatest pleasure to hand over to Leilani and Anna Jane to talk to us this morning. Kia ora. And I'm just going to stop screen sharing so that we can see them.
Kia ora Penny and whawhkai ke le lawa for that lovely introduction. Tēnā tātou katoa. It's great to see you all, albeit virtually from across the motu. I can see some lovely friendly faces there. Lofi, I can see you. So before we kick off, I would just like to start with setting the tone of our talanoa with a karakia. So for those who feel comfortable, please just bow your heads, and if you feel okay about it, close your eyes. And it's just creating the right space and intentionality for this moment. Tawhia tō mana kia mau kia maia, ka huri taku aro ki te pai kahurangi, kei reira te oranga mōku, mā mahi tahi, ka ora ka pūwai, a mātou mahi katoa, ka pono, ka tika, tihei, mauri ora. Morena, it's great to see you all. For those I haven't met before, my name is Leilani, Lea Whaiturangi Tamu. I am I'm a manager of a team called Langa Leva, which is a name that my team gave itself. We didn't ask for permission at MB, we just gave it to ourselves because it's an indigenous name from across Te Moana Nui a Kiwa. Langa Leva means to weave or build or create the space. Our Te Ao Pākehā title is Pacific Policy, which sounds incredibly boring in my from my perspective, and also Pacific is not an Indigenous name, of course. It was given to our region by the Portuguese. So our team quite likes Langa Leva, but Hiki na Whakatūtuki MB still calls this Pacific Policy, and that's fine too. So this morning I'm going to be sharing some thoughts and reflections with you in partnership with Anna Jane, my colleague who I deeply respect and work with regularly. But first I'm going to pass to Anna, who's just going to set the scene by telling you a little bit about the particular initiative we've been working on together for about 3 years now.
Kia ora ana tātou katoa. Ko Anna Jane Edwards tōku ingoa, but people call me Anna, and it's a really interesting, I'll share quickly how I have been known my whole life as Anna, and then I come into Auckland Council a few years ago and they said that I needed to be known by my formal name, which is Anna Jane. And it's an example of how the system has a certain way of doing things, hey, and wouldn't allow me to be recognized as the name that I have been known for my whole life. So I've kept that, but everyone that has a relationship with me calls me Anna Jane or AJ. I am the leader of Uptempo, a brand new initiative which looks at how we can focus in on one of our greatest opportunities to create intergenerational wealth for and with Pasifika people. And that's through workforce progression. So I really love the question that was posed at the start of today around what ways do me and my team shape the conditions for working together differently. And I think for us in Uptempo and in partnership with Leilani and her team, it's really about demonstrating what different looks like for Pasifika and enabling that pipeline for Pasifika people to progress within the workforce and create intergenerational wealth. So I'm just going to give a really quick background to how Uptempo came about and then hand it back over to Leilani in a second. If you see me looking here, that's because you all beautiful people are over here and my camera is right in front of me. So we started on a journey about 3.5 years ago now with MB, looking at what was happening for Pacific people in the workforce. The Co-Design Lab had done a really great piece of work around the attitude gap, which looked at what was happening for young people within the workforce. And what it showed is that the young people from South Auckland had a particular view of work, and employers had a different view to young people within South Auckland. So that was creating a gap in terms of expectations and readiness for the workforce and attachment to the labour market. I was really interested at that time at what was happening for Pasifika people as they were progressing within the workforce. So we looked at what was happening for Pacific people 10 years down the track, after those young people had entered into the workforce. What we found was that Pasifika people were entering into the workforce in low-skilled, low-paid work and were staying there for most of their careers. So there was a whole heap of untapped potential for those people within a mismatch between what they were doing in their work and the skills that they had outside of their work, and earning power, I guess. And so we brought together a small group of people from across South Auckland to test what it would take to support people to progress within the workforce. So these are people that are already in work, stuck in low-skilled, low-paid work, and wanting to progress into high-skilled, higher-paid work, which we call sunrise industries, but didn't know how to do that. What we found was that if there is a clear focus on workforce progression, just-in-time learning, and partnerships with employers, we're able to bridge that gap. And the other key thing is around taking a whole of family approach to that, recognizing, like that work is only one part of a person's life, and for us as Pacific people, family are key in the decisions in which we make around career progression, and that there are a whole heap of other challenges for many of our families that result in people making the decisions that they're making to stay in the jobs that they're in. So that is how Uptempo was born. Last year, in partnership with Leilani's team, they put in a budget bid, and that resulted in a $22 million injection into Auckland as a part of Alo Waka, Auckland Pacific Skills Shift. So I'll hand it over to you, Leilani, hey?
So, I mean, this is always the hard thing, right? Is almost when you're trying to give that kind of high level description, you can never quite get into the nitty gritty of the hard. But I can say, attest along with AJ that there's been a lot of tears and long late nights over the last 3 years to get to this point. The design for Alo Waka Auckland Pacific Skill Shift, of which Uptempo is one part, was really pushing the boundaries of what, from a government policy perspective, we would traditionally invest in and fund, because what we were trying to do was say that actually, in order for government to play its part well here, working in complexity, we needed to have high trust relationships with our partners. We needed to support and create the conditions for social innovation to occur. And we needed to have a degree of flexibility and agility in the design, so that actually, as we learn and as insights emerge from the work, we can adapt and change together. The other critical piece of this is how can we have a real-time relationship, so that as those insights are gained through the practice on the ground, we could be informing government cross-system policy making. And so when we put that budget bid in, and Minister Robertson liked it, which was great, because it ticked the box in terms of future work. The government is increasingly starting to think about quality employment, about the importance of skills as opposed to just any jobs. We got it over the line, but we got it over the line without any departmental resourcing for a start, which it was any manager's nightmare. So I had to find from existing, I had the money for the partners, but no money internally for my team to manage it. And then also really underneath the hood of it, especially in a COVID context, doing the constant work of trying to get our colleagues across the system, the policymakers, to understand that this wasn't just a traditional active labour market intervention, as they refer to it. This is about long-term enduring change. And every day my team still struggles with that, because as many of you will know, we still get the spreadsheets from, for example, MSD to fill out, you know, with the how many people have got jobs and, you know, breaking it down. But that stuff, as we all know, that's not the change. Like, that short-term stuff is actually not the change, not when we're talking about these issues that actually have been really entrenched and have been around for a really long time. And secondly, not when we're working with partners in a respectful way, where we actually are saying to them, we know this takes time and we want to give you some breathing room and some space. Yes, there's key accountabilities, but we don't want you to just be reporting on outputs for us every quarter. So these are some of the tensions and challenges that we can still continuing to navigate with it. Having said that, I think between AJ and I in particular, we've been able to insulate, and I think AJ, and you know, I'm looking at AJ, I think over at Auckland Council, there are similar challenges with just the way the systems are set up within the organisation. And so in some ways we play buffer roles, I think, and we both recognise that we have a degree of not only positional power, but also responsibility to do that. And so to a certain extent, we insulate our team members so that they can get on and do the work. A couple of other points I wanted to make before I hand back to AJ, just with any other things she'd like to add from that. When I first started this work and thinking with AJ 3 years ago, initially I thought about creating the enabling conditions, but increasingly I'm thinking more and more about how do we empower and how do we share power. That's a key thing for me, because I think there's quite a big difference between enabling and empowering, particularly when you think about the role of government and how government can share power in a meaningful way. Secondly, I've touched on this, but you know, it is lonely and hard work. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. And I think in terms of government, we're much better at thinking about working in complicated spaces and figuring out formulas that then we can replicate over and over again, as opposed to thinking about working in complexity and creating space for emergent practice. And because of that, I find that I'm constantly having to do quite a lot of lateral and upwards education around actually what emergent practice looks and feels like, and why actually the reality of the world we live in is complex, not complicated. Thirdly, I wanted to talk about some reflections. So I left the public service. So I'm not a linear public servant. I was in for 6 years and then I left for 6 years and then I came back into this role. But one of my observations is that I really see that there's a lot of dehumanized systems and across government this is taken for granted. And that really, really concerns me, because we talk a lot about people-centered, whether it's people-centered policy making or people-centered leadership. But in actual fact, the systems and processes we use, I would say to a large extent, are dehumanized. They don't put people at the center. And I can speak more to this if you'd like in the Q&A. But in policy practice in particular, what I see is we still make policy for the majority, who in this country country is generally the middle class Pākehā majority, and we don't think about putting the priority groups who have not been served by government policy at the centre and making policy for them first. But I'll hand back to you, AJ, for some closing words before Q&A.
Oh, those are such great insights, Leilani. I just wanted to pick up on your comment around insulating the team and being a buffer of the team, and just thinking about how we have managed to get buy-in to some of the things that people would think potentially are not what local government should be doing, and deemed risky. And I think one of the ways in which we've done it in Uptempo is partner with a philanthropic organisation, J.R. Mackenzie Trust and Peter Mackenzie Project, to bring in some money that augments the MB funding, so we're able to demonstrate what different looks like when it is culturally grounded in Pasifika concepts and worldviews. And if we were to give families money without any kind of other constraints, but the fact of giving them cash, what would that actually do? Would the sky fall down? And how can that then be translated into something that's useful at a central government level? And the other thing that I really wanted to pick up on, Lani, was just what you said around it being a hard and lonely space. And I feel really lucky in the sense that I'm a part of the Southern Initiative and have a group of colleagues that are deeply committed to this work and get this way of working. And so my biggest encouragement to anyone that is thinking about doing more of this stuff is to find your tribe within your organisation, find the people that are going to inspire you to continue doing it and help to open the doors. One of the other things that we had to do lots when we were thinking about this complex problem around growing intergenerational wealth for Pasifika was thinking about the transdisciplinary nature of it and all of the different people that need to be a part of the solution to it. So not only thinking about the like-minded people, but the odd sorts that can contribute to a different perspective and potentially challenge your thinking around things, but knowing that you all are on the same bucket and journeying to the same place helps to keep that space safe, hey? And enable you to have really robust discussions and create different solutions to some of these things. And then my last thing was just around the power dynamics of preferencing Pasifika whānau through Uptempo. So there is a stream in our work where families are developing the solutions to some of these wicked problems, and how families' voice, individuals' views aren't necessarily seen as important within an organisation like ours. So how are we creating the space for people's voices to be heard? And how, like the way that we've been able to do it is by starting small, demonstrating with a small number of families, and then pulling the insights out of that in terms of what can be scaled to enable. And this is both demonstrating what scaling deep, so that long-term attachment to the labour market, long-term progression in the labour market, long-term creation of intergenerational wealth, but also recognising that the system is looking for, often looking for scaling wide initiatives like Leilani was talking about. So getting the balance of those two things right, so that you get further buy-in to what you know are the bigger systemic changes that you're looking for. The last thing that I would probably add is just around the way in which you communicate the work. So for us, it's trying a number of different ways of communicating it through different people, through different mediums, and knowing that not one way is going to be the right way, but the thing that you're looking for is that change in hearts and minds. And often we're asking for small things from people to get to help them to get a shade braver and buy into the bigger things.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Korua. I'm just gonna, in a minute, what we're gonna do is give the group a few minutes to go into some smaller groups, talk with each other about what they've heard, and then come back with some questions, and we'll be able to go a little bit more deeply into some of the things that you've laid out for us. Before we do that, I just thought, could I ask you, AJ, just to talk just a little bit about who's involved, because I think it's quite interesting to know, you know, you guys have talked about for meaningful shift, there's actually lots of parts of the system that need to be engaged, centering families in the middle. But I think it would be interesting just to hear the kind of collective that you've already brought together as being a group amongst which power needs to be shared, and just talk us a little bit through that sort of form of who's actually making up with the families at the centre, just so to have that picture of who's involved, because I think that in itself is a different way of configuring so that it's not an active labour market intervention, it's actually a change initiative. So if I could just maybe ask you to talk a little bit to that, and then I'll come back and we'll just have some time in smaller groups to unpack and then come back with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, I can talk a little bit about the partners in Uptempo, and then I'll hand it over to you, Leilani, to talk a bit more about the partners in waka. So when we were putting our proposal together for MB, we were looking around at who could help us to do this. We are an innovation unit, you know, so we know innovation methodology, and we just happen to be within a local government context, so we know that. But we are in a social service, and while we have relationships with employers, that is also not necessarily our specialty. So we were looking to find partners that had deep knowledge and experiences in those spaces, and have partnered with the Whono, a primary health organisation in Auckland that is, I think it's one of the only Pasifika PHOs. It's definitely the largest. And it also has a whānau order contract with Pasifika Futures. And that for us was a really interesting partnership, not only for the incredible connections that they have and relationships they have within our community, but the way in which the practice, their medical practices, their social services are all grounded in Pasifika worldview and concepts. And then the second partner is First Union, a trade union with 35,000 members across New Zealand, but who have a big membership, a big Pasifika membership. I think there's nearly 6,000 members in Auckland, primarily in manufacturing, transport logistics, and retail. So it's been, this is the first time that we've partnered with either in this type of way, but knew that it's a kind of demonstration of that transdisciplinary thinking, knew that we needed unusual suspects to partner with, and it's been 6 months, I think, and we're still figuring out what that partnership, how that partnership works and what it looks like, but it's going well so far.
And just to add to what AJ's described, so if I helicopter up just a level, so probably 18 months ago, you know, when my policy analyst and I were trying to get this down for Treasury, what we were really clear on was you know, with Pasifika peoples, we know which occupation types, which industries we're heavily concentrated in, and we also know that 60% of our population is in Tāmaki Makaurau, and of that 50% in South Auckland. So, you know, as you start to go, okay, these are our known knowns and we're our unknowns, we were like, okay, let's unashamedly go through a placemaking initiative. So it is very much, you know, Alo Waka, the Auckland Pacific Skill Shift, and then underneath the design we have 3 components, of which Uptempo is, I would say, at the heart of it. It's a really critical component, partly because it grew from that first report that AJ described. So that's really centering whānau at the centre, and it's about collective decision making within the household and engaging with every member of that household. Then we have another 2 components and 2 other key partners. We have Auckland Unlimited, formerly ATs, and so their piece there is really focusing on obviously working directly with employers, but also thinking about the economic landscape in Auckland and how sectors and industries are changing and the skills landscape and what that might mean. And so the key piece we've got them focusing on is the delivery of in-work training and micro-credentials in particular, working with employers who have large numbers of Pasifika workers. And then we have a 3rd partner, the Cause Collective, which is a relatively small NGO based in South Auckland. They came from the health sector, and a big focus of what they do is they work with communities. And so some of their work in the past, for example, has been doing street-based work. And so it's like, how do you activate and get a whole street and community to be talking about and thinking about the future of work and making decisions about actually from a placemaking perspective, how they want to engage with employers and skills-based opportunities, and how they can, I think, if I sum it up, get ahead of the, or leapfrog some of the structural inequity challenges that we know are playing out, particularly for our young people. So those are the 3 partners. And conceptually, the idea is, if you imagine 3 railway tracks, they're each doing their own thing, talking to each other at the moment, but conceptually the hope is that in about 6 months they'll all be at a relatively mature state and be able to be thinking about where mergers can naturally occur. So we're just in the process of thinking about how do we build that culture and those relationships in a deep way, not a shallow way. But you can imagine that's quite a lot of work, so keeping me up at night as well. And I hand back to you, Penny.
Awesome. Thank you so much both for just giving us some of that broader context too, really helpful. And a lot to take in as well. So we're just going to give everyone a minute. I'm just using your own reflection sheet. Just take a minute to pull out a couple of threads of what you heard. There's a lot of things being highlighted here that Leilani and Anna Jane are paying attention to and noticing, and if you like, the materials that they're working with in the complexity of this. So just take a minute to jot down a few things, and then we're going to put you into breakout groups to have a bit of a conversation about that, and then we're going to come back and talk some more. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds or so just to get your own thinking down and some thoughts so that you can take that into the smaller group. Kia ora. Thanks so much, Korua. Great. So now Baruch will put you into some smaller groups. Just have a bit of a conversation about what you heard. And now the invitation of our question is, what kinds of things do we need to be paying attention to then to grow the conditions for this way of working? Particularly looking at ourselves within government, the different things that we need to pay attention to. There was a lot mentioned through the kōrero so far about the different levels and points at which Anna Jane and Leilani are sort of navigating the system. There was mindsets, there was beliefs, there was contracts, there was teams, all sorts of things. So the invitation, just have a bit of a conversation with the group, 15 minutes about thereabouts. So again, if you get the chance to meet some new people, introduce yourselves as well. And then we'll come back with some questions for Leilani and AJ for the last 10 or 15 minutes. So I'll let Baruch do the magic bit, and we'll see you back here very shortly. E te whānau. Kia ora. Kia ora. Was whether the challenges that you need to insulate the team from were cultural or systemic, and if so, what, if they're systemic, what needs changing? So I just throw that to you, Leilani, and that will help definitely dig into a few different dimensions. Kia ora.
So they're both. So I just said in the breakout room, I'm gonna use the word, the kryptonite of Aotearoa. Systemic racism and institutionalized racism is just part and parcel of our society and the power structures, right? So firstly, I have to insulate my team from that, from working in a Eurocentric organisation that privileges particular ways of working, values, power and knowledge. and that's the reality of being in a population-based policy team. Within that context, there's a set of practices that then underpin culture. And I don't mean culture in an ethnographic sense here. I just mean culture in terms of way of working. And there'll be a question about this later, I think, but it is very removed from the people that we serve in terms of the policy making process, in terms of the discussions. It's very removed from the inequities and lived experience on the ground. And, you know, when you just think about the demographics of most public servants, and then you think about the different layers of privilege that come with that, and the lack of critical thinking and discussion around what it means to have that privilege. And then it's also really removed in terms of what I call, like, there's not a deep culture of collaboration in the public service. So it's very much the silo and the transactions are normalized. And so the email churn, the kind of clip of the day, and there's a lot of worshipping on the altar of productivity, you know, the spinning wheels at all costs and ministers wanting X and Y, but no one's stopping and just going, let's take a minute here to ask why we're doing this and actually what's important. So I'm constantly having to push back and, you know, just normalizing things like, you know, how like my team, I say, I do not want my team members working within a 24-hour cycle of response. I think that's not human. I think that's unjust. And likewise, I wouldn't want that for my partners either. So those are some of the things we insulate from, as well as just the things that are frustrating around ignorance and not understanding the whakapapa and the context that's contributed to why Pacific peoples today are in the situation they're in Aotearoa.
Kia ora. I sort of alluded to this when we opened, that the words co-design and innovation can be used as a distraction from actually addressing the histories of colonization and structural racism. You know, they're sort of like, we'll go and innovate a silver bullet to rather than get to the nitty-gritty of actually what's at the heart of this. So appreciate you drawing our attention into that, which is really behind and needs to be the focus of the energy of these efforts. So kind of in that vein, just talking to Anna Jane about that difference between the innovation mode and the transactional delivery mode, and the different roles that need to be played if we are shifting the way we're working, whether we use the word innovation or whether it's actually, you know, that's actually not a helpful term, because we're trying to shift transformational to transformational ways of working instead of transactional ways of working. So AJ, do you want to talk to us a little bit about what that shift means and the kind of roles that you take on in your team to enable that?
Yeah, it's I think it leads back to my point around the way in which we communicate the work. So whenever we're talking about Uptempo, we're always framing it as this is about intergenerational wealth creation for Pasifika communities. And so if anything is going to anyone, whether they're a partner, a stakeholder, or a whānau, we're always also talking about working in partnership with families, community organisations and others to look under the hood of all of the different roles in which we play to create that change. One of the things that we get challenged with all the time is, but how many people are actually getting into jobs? And while that is really important, I'm constantly reframing that question to be, this is actually about long-term attachment to the labour market and creating intergenerational wealth for Pasifika families. And to do that, you need to recognise that it's not only about the individual making that change into that job, it's about taking that whole family on a journey, and the job is the way in which they enable their aspirations to be met. And so it's often having to re-say the same thing over and over and over and over again to the same people to help it sink in, and also find that balance between actually meeting outputs that people understand. So you still need to get people into jobs, right? But it's what does the employer need to do to welcome, attract, retain and progress Pasifika talent within their organization? What does that industry need to do to enable that? And what do we need to do to bridge that gap? Just-in-time learning, support people who potentially have never made this. I think about it in terms of my life, and when I'm looking at making a change in job, it's a big decision. And for people that have never made that step change, it's even harder because they don't know what to expect. So how do you demystify that process, take a family on board along that individual's journey as well, and recognize that employers, policymakers and others all play a role in that, and keep it focused on this is about intergenerational wealth, because our interactions with some parts of government agencies is, but we have a directive from politicians to count how many people are going into jobs this month. So then you get that cycle of just getting people into any job rather than a quality job, and them cycling out of that job 3 or 4 months later because it hasn't been focused on what people need to be successful and work long term.
What are some of the kind of skills and capabilities that you're trying to cultivate in teams and systems in order to make those shifts?
I'll take this one first, AJ, and then I think both of us. I mean, so for me, it is I really believe diversity of thought is critical, because you know, the moment you have groupthink, then you've got so many blind spots you don't even know they exist. And so across my team, for example, one of the most radical things I did early on was I had a service designer in the team rather than a senior policy analyst. And I remember I was challenged for that, and it was quite confronting. But over the 10 months that person was in my team, I was able to get them to do a systems diagram and map of government investment in employment and skills for Pacific that had never been done before, and provide that to ministers so they could have that view that they needed of actually what the different focuses were, who was being targeted in terms of expenditure, and where the gaps were. And so those design skills for me are really critical, but also my service designer, one of the key things about her is she'd take a persona-based approach to the work. So it was this beautiful collaboration with my policy advisors, who tend to be much more in terms of the crafting and the wordsmithing and a bit of the cost benefit analysis. But when I step back from that, really what I look for are values and qualities that perhaps aren't so technical. So I look for people who are obviously committed to wanting to make a difference. I look for people who are brave, because I think you've got to be brave to work in the public service and keep going. And I look for people who are willing to be as innovative as they feel comfortable being, So when you talk about that word, Penny, I think innovation means different things for different people. And so I try to create space for people to figure out what that means for them.
Kia ora. Did you want to talk to that, AJ? Yeah.
Just quickly, you've touched on most of them, Leilani, but one of the other things for us is an aptitude to be able to do at a community level, but understand systems and be able to move up and down between those two things. And that's often one of the hardest things to find. You find people that are able to do one or the other. And so one of our challenges, I think, in TSI overall is how you build the capability of people to go up and down and understand the whole.
Awesome. And that talks to your point about being able to work more in complexity and some of the things we've talked about in the last couple of days about collapsing the distance between some of the centralized power and decision making and actually what goes on for families. One of the things that stood out from our first day was talking about how whānau have no problem working in complexity. They welcome that as a start point for their mahi and their design processes because that's their lived experience every day. So one of the things, we've probably got about 5 minutes and I'll try and get at least two more questions in. One is just, could you give us some examples and maybe start with AJ and then go to Leilani of where you're having to negotiate power sharing already, those moments where you're like, oh, this is an example of us, either us or our partners needing to think about how we rejig something so that we are actually sharing power or negotiate power sharing differently. What does that actually look like, sharing power in this kind of process?
I can share like a one that's ongoing at the moment in our organisation, and it's around the development of a CRM that would help hold and honour all of our whānau's contributions, and we have this process within Auckland Council around how that is developed and how any suppliers come into our space, and that's a 17-week process that we need to go through that includes all sorts of technical reports being developed by the supplier, who in this case is a Pacific provider, and so we're saying actually we need something now to be able to support our families and the team to collect that data safely and honour their contribution to this work. But other parts of council are saying to us, no, you need to follow this process. And it's a 17-week process and you need to follow every step, and it includes all of these different things. And so it's being able to elevate that conversation to senior leaders and be like, hey, this as a clear example of how we've got this funding from MB. This is about supporting Pasifika people to progress within the workforce, and this isn't enabling us to do that. And it's actually putting a whole heap of stress on us and the team to be able to meet the contractual requirements that we have with MB. But it's constantly kind of using our my manager at a senior leadership level to be able to have these conversations across the organisation around challenging why a process is the way it is and who it actually serves. And in this instance, it's not serving the communities in which we have been funded to do this work for and with. And so it's a constant, this is, like it's almost pulling your hair out, frustration. And I'm just really lucky that we have others that are across the team that kind of are really great at helping to expedite these types of processes. And that's, I think, an example of where it gets a bit lonely and hard.
Awesome, thank you, AJ. Your visual's breaking up a bit, but we're still getting your beautiful sound, so that's all good. Leilani, if you wanted to share some examples of what power sharing looks like in your context, and also I'll just let you know one other question that's sitting there if we've got time to get to it around sharing this work with wider colleagues and decision makers and how you can go about doing that. There's another one here which I don't know if we'll get to, but is around, does the process in itself build well-being? And I think the building of capacity and change that you're doing through the work that you're talking about is as relevant and important as any of the outputs you're getting to at the end, right? Like this process that you're describing for us is in and of itself the change process that starts to shift outcomes. So just giving that as a background context, but yeah, examples of the power sharing that you're having to either facilitate or experience and sharing that more widely, that would be great if we could hear from you, and then we're going to let you close up as well.
Okay, so just quickly, so on the power sharing one, a key thing critical component for me from the outset was with 3 quite different, quite distinct community partners, and a range of different government agencies who have all have a role to play and an interest in skill shift. How do we create the conditions in terms of the design and way of working that actually mean it can be like true to the kaupapa at the heart of it? So it's not just about the outcomes and the outputs, but it's actually the way of working. So one of the things we did was we invested in getting an independent facilitator that all 3 partners were happy with, and she ran 2 different deep dive sessions with us and the partners and government agencies who could attend, around primarily focusing on the values and principles and ways of working. And that's a really important process, and culturally that's fully aligned to me as a woman from the moana, right? You start there, and so it took 2 days and then a working group which has only just really landed that work, and so it takes time but also a willingness to invest and support it and give it that time. But that ultimately then becomes not only sort of a kawa setting for all of us, but also an accountability piece, because it's not easy, and it's important to invest that time and energy in that work. So that's one for me in terms of the power sharing. The challenge is, as we all know, with the turnover across the public sector, is, for example, my DCE, above me, he's acting at the moment. So the new appointment's going to be relevant, because those conditions, the linear conditions in the hierarchy above, also then make a difference. So there's a little bit of bated breath for me going, okay, what's that going to look like? How am I going to get this person to understand it deeply and quickly? And then the other question, Penny, can you just remind me what it was quickly?
It was about sharing, just sharing this widely. So if you could, we'll go to the break in a minute. So if you're happy just to do a 30 seconds.
So very quickly, so as Anna said, storytelling and communications is key. So we're giving some thought to that at the moment, but at a practical level, out of COVID last year, one of the things I noticed was that no one across the public sector working on Pacific stuff was talking to each other as a collective. So I created a Zoom talanoa called Pacific Economic Officials Group. It's an informal group, meets every fortnight, has a range of different officials, and then so we meet and then we have a subject. My team facilitates and coordinates it. It's a working lunch, and we the process this year is going to be, we're going to be asking each of the partners to come and share and engage with the different officials from across government, because it kind of flattens it. So for me, that's about that collaboration and partnership across. Cool.
Beautiful, awesome examples. I can't thank you enough for coming, sharing your honesty, and just kind of throwing the door open to where you've been, where you are now, and where you're heading. And I know everyone will be looking forward to supporting this mahi and staying in contact with it. So thank you again so much for your time. We will go to a break. We'll be coming back at 10:55 to continue unpacking these threads of almost what we often refer to as the boring part of the innovation, what's actually going on in the back room and of the work to make this actually possible for us to be working differently. Leilani is going to close their session for us, and after she's done that, we'll just move into that break time. So I'll just pass it back to Leilani to close, and thank you so much. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Penny, and to the organisers for an awesome session, and just acknowledge you too, AJ, and all the great work you're doing. This is my favourite karakia, because I feel like it connects Aotearoa to our moana in so many ways. So if you feel comfortable, just bow your head, close your eyes. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapapaunamu te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa, haumie, huie, taiki e.
Welcome back, everybody. I've still got my coffee. It was too short a break. So I'm Gina Gleisner, Teina Evaluation Collective. We've now got a session, Gaze on Government, and we've got these wonderful speakers here. And what we're really trying to focus on, and hearing their stories, is how do we create the conditions together so that we can build the capability and the appetite for this work. I just want you to be, so I'll introduce them one by one. We won't have questions in between. We're going to have the 3 sessions. They're talking for about 6 to 8 minutes each. And then we're moving on for your ideas. And I just want you to know that every day we spend the afternoon going through your ideas, collating them and taking them on board. So please do put in chat at any time during these talks what you're thinking about. So we've got Debbie Goodwin, who you've met before, who's going to be talking about evaluating co-design from a Māori perspective. Then we have Bronwyn Petrie from the Ministry of Health, and she'll be talking about co-designing Healthy Homes Initiative lessons for public servants. In the breakout room, she was saying, it's interesting, sometimes you do it under the radar and sometimes you don't. And those are different challenges. And then we have Tamsin Evans from the Ministry of Culture and Heritage talking about who's steering the waka, a partnership approach in practice. So without further ado, we'll move straight on to Debbie. Welcome, Debbie.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Can everyone hear me? Ai. Ko mā tātua tōku waka, ko tūhoi, ko whakatohia oku iwi, ko te rewerewa, ko roimata oku marae, ko Debbie Goodwin tōku ingoa. It's great to be back and to have a little kōrero about some of the work that I've been doing in my PhD, which I've finally handed in and I'm very pleased about. But I think one of the first things that actually resonated with me this morning was what AJ talked about, actually the personal thing she shared about her name. And I thought that, you know, something small like that creates a great impact, and something to think about for us going forward as well, as that small things that do create great impacts. I reflected on my name being Waireka. That's my middle name given to me by my father, and it's my queer's name. And he was pretty much the only one that called me Waireka. So I'm just reflecting on the kōrero this morning really, and thinking about how small things can create great impacts on us. So kia ora. I just also wanted to reflect on what Carl shared yesterday, a beautiful picture of the history of co-design, kind of how an innovation in New Zealand, in Aotearoa. And I thought this might be useful to reflect on. This was a framing that I developed and used for my PhD research, which was around developing a kaupapa Māori framework for evaluating co-design mahi with Māori. And this just reflects in a different way how I thought about co-design, and particularly the Te Ao Māori approaches that we use in Aotearoa and the Western approaches, which have been referred to as kind of the go-to for design thinking and things like that. It brings out a few other aspects like the participatory research approaches, critical social science kind of kaupapa, and also there's a lot of design kōrero around co-design and co-production within the public and citizen participation paradigm. So these are just some thoughts about where all this thinking and kōrero comes from around co-design. And when I first started and opened up this hui, I talked about in the broader sense, co-design is about working together. And I think it's important, it's really important to understand the people that you're asking to be in co-design. What is their view of co-design? So an example would be that mostly communities, Māori providers, whānau, would think of co-design in a broader sense than, say, from a particular theoretical background, for example. So it's important to be clear about what methodology you're using, what whakaaro you're coming from in co-design, but to understand those that are involved in co-design, that you're inviting into co-design, also are able to reflect their understanding of co-design. So that's just a little kōrero on conceptually thinking about where co-design might sit and the many places that it might sit. One of the other things I think that would be important to understand is that co-design is not well evaluated. We do lots of it, we don't evaluate a lot of it. So what it means is that we don't have a lot of real evidence, you know, around co-design, but it is developing and we do need to evaluate it more. So hence my kaupapa. What we do hear and see about co-design is maybe some of the outcomes and the outputs and the results of an actual project, but we don't really think about the process and we don't necessarily evaluate the process. So what part of what I did in my PhD was to work with a Māori health organisation called Toi Tangata, and from the in-depth kōrero with the team who were participating in a national science health co-design project, as well as also facilitating co-design, to kōrero to them about what does good co-design look like for Māori. And from that, I developed some key themes, and from that developed different methods and ways of evaluating it. And I brought these together and I ended up calling it the Tukutuku framework. There's lots of names I've used, different framework names, but to pull all these pieces together of ways of evaluating our co-design process as Māori, I've called it Tukutuku. What I liked about it is that it reflects, if you can see in the picture, that it is a collaborative approach, it is a collaborative mahi that we do. And when we develop, well, if we look at Tukutuku as a beautiful design approach and what it takes, and ask ourselves, what does it take? And, you know, how is that Tukutuku panel designed and developed and made? How is it made? And that going back to our mātauranga, our taonga tuku iho like this was just an important lesson for me, to understand actually the ways that we work as Māori, as collectively, that there are so many lessons for us from our mātauranga. So when I thought about Nani doing these tukutuku, my mum also participated, who's over 80. So she's a nanny, of course. She's not in this picture, but she did a little bit of this tukutuku panel. The thing that's important to understand is this takes a lot of time. And we've talked about time. It takes expert knowledge, it takes manaaki, it takes ako, it takes collectivity, creativity and skill. And I ask myself, what happens when we do this, if we participate in this process as a metaphor for co-design? Well, I know there'll be a lot of laughing going on, as you can probably see in this picture, and there's mentoring, there's kōrero, a lot of kōrero while you're doing this. There's relationships being built over time. There's sometimes honesty, honest relationships, honest kōrero. So that's just one reflection here of what I think co-design is as Māori. Well, there's our M piece actually. This is the panels up in Māori Presbyterian Church in Whakatane. So one of the things that I also developed in terms of what does good co-design look like for Māori, so going back to the kōrero with Toi Tangata, these were the themes that came up and the core things that were important to us as Māori. Hononga, connected and trusting relationships, mahitahi, working together as one and having agreed processes. Tikanga me ngā kawa, so respecting the tikanga and kawa of our participants and those, our partners. Ngā pukenga, sharing the expertise and skills across the group, across the rōpū. And ngā hua, what are the outcomes that are equitable for the partners and for the people involved? And tino rangatiratanga, so self-determination, how does co-design support that? This is just an example of how you might ask questions around each of those concepts. So there you might have sub-dimensions around those concepts and ask the questions. I think this is helpful for thinking about what I said earlier, was that the broadest sense of co-design, if you ask a community to co-design with you, they're going to think they're involved in most of these levels of projects, in the governance, the management, defining the problem, designing the process, designing the solution, implementing the solution, evaluating and disseminating information about it. So this is just another little tool that you could use to think about who's participating in each of these parts of your project, and is the end user involved? So is the whānau, the community, involved in these at these levels, and why or why not? Because you may decide there may be different roles. And what are the power differences or the power sharing strategies that you might use in each of these situations? So I guess just to wrap up, evaluation throughout the design process, the co-design process, is something that I would encourage. And you can ask yourself, what does good look like in a co-design process? What do we want at the end of it as well? What does good look like? And actually monitor or evaluate that as you go along. I'm just going to finish there. I know that was a lot in a little short time, but we have others to talk to as well. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Debbie. That's a fantastic reminder that we can all contribute to all the knowledge about this by continually evaluating. And it gives us a very important set of things to ask as we go. So thank you so much. I do apologize. I've got a sort of flicker across my screen. I'm learning a great deal at this symposium, both about Te Ao Māori and co-design and technology. So I'm sorry about the flicker. So thank you very much, Debbie. And just to remind you all, you will get these slides, so you will be able to continue to learn from them in the future. So now, with great pleasure, I introduced Bronwyn Petrie, and she will talk about the Healthy Homes Initiative and the whole co-design journey that they've been through. Thank you, Bronwyn. Welcome.
Hi everyone, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Bronwyn Petrie toko ingoa no Otatahi o, I noho ana ki tamaki makoto, I mahi ana ki manatu haora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Hi everyone, I'm mindful of the time and I'm trying to talk as fast as I can. Look, work at the Ministry of Health and manage a team, an amazing team called Healthy Communities, and we get to do some really cool stuff in the determinants and prevention space with a strong focus on equity and tiriti, including things like healthy families, healthy homes, which I'll talk to, rheumatic fever, and a whole raft of other really cool stuff. Really delighted to be here today, and it sounds like there's been some great discussion over the past few days as well. Look, I just wanted to really quickly say a bit about who I am, but also more specifically that I am not an expert in anything really. So it feels weird to be speaking to you today. But, and also I wanted to acknowledge all of those, a few online who I know and have seen who are experts in and around the co-design space. And so apologies if I go a bit rogue or if the language isn't right. But I guess what I wanted to do is kind of highlight my experience and my observations and reflections and surprises through my more recent co-design experience. But firstly, I just wanted to acknowledge a few people. The earlier presenters, Leilani, AJ, I hope I can call you that, and Debbie, really insightful and inspiring presentations, especially for a Friday morning when my brain's just a wee bit fatigued. I also wanted to acknowledge the work I'm just about to talk about. Clearly, I didn't do a lot of the heavy lifting. That was TSI and our providers and partners. So I wanted to acknowledge all of the providers, partners and friends in the healthy home space, whether they were involved in the co-design or not, because they have made the program really what it is. So yeah, I'm just going to speak really briefly about the Healthy Homes Initiative, the co-design project, and my experience and observations of the journey. But before I do that, and I will be very brief, I could talk about the Healthy Homes Initiative until the cows come home, but I'll just say 3 or 4 very brief points on it. And there's more information available at the links down below. But clearly you'd be living in a cave if you didn't realise that we have housing issues in New Zealand. They're cold, mouldy and damp, and housing is a key determinant of health, wellbeing and hauora. The Healthy Homes Initiative, or the HHI, as we love an acronym, as you can imagine, was established in around 2012-13, started in Auckland, rolled out to the rest of the country. And the focus initially was on reducing household crowding to reduce the transmission of Group A strep, which is a precursor to rheumatic fever. So it was established as part of the rheumatic fever program. And then its scope was widened with money from budget 16 to focus on warm, dry, healthy homes. There's been a bit of discussion about whānau-centred, but we do really try hard to ensure our providers take a whānau-centred approach. And there's lots of warm, fuzzy stories I could tell you about how they do that, but they do it beautifully. There is no cookie cutter approach with this. And just really simply, our providers are asked to identify eligible families, to undertake a house and whānau assessment, to work with whomever to get the interventions that whānau need to be living in a warm, dry, healthy home, and the interventions include kind of insulation, curtains, yada, yada, yada. And then importantly, to follow up with that whānau to see if it's made a difference, and maybe if they've moved house to start the process over again. But look, way back in 2015, we had set up this program, and it'll be a couple of years in, but we really wanted to understand more about the intervention space. And we were learning as we went with this program. And it's a bit like a screening program in a way that you set up a program, and if you don't have the treatment to offer at the end, then it's pretty unethical to do in the first place. So we knew we had some interventions in place, but we didn't really know the breadth and the depth of those interventions. So we kind of stumbled upon TSI and contracted them with a really small amount of money to undertake a co-design process to specifically focus on how we build a sustainable supply of housing-related interventions to support our 2 Healthy Homes initiatives in Auckland. We wanted to try something different, and we really wanted to understand the whānau experience of this program and to see what was working, what wasn't, and why, and what we could do better, really. And TSI, bless them, they worked with all of our partners and providers and friends to identify, test, and implement a number of prototypes and interventions to understand and unpick what we could be doing better to strengthen that. And there's 2 really excellent reports if you need some bedtime reading that can be found at that link. So I'm talking fast, so apologies for that. Surprises and reflections. We weren't really sure what we were getting into. I have been public health and government both here and in the UK, and I had heard it mentioned, wasn't really sure what it was. So we were going in somewhat blind, but excited. We had already been taking a learn by doing approach with the Healthy Homes Initiative, but we really kind of leaned into it in this space and started to talk about that fast fail or safe fail kind of idea. And again, that was quite a new approach, especially from a government perspective where failure isn't really tolerated or certainly not encouraged. But that's the kind of ethos that we took, and a strong partnership approach with CSI as well. There was definitely some nervousness about the outcomes and results, and I remember my partner in crime, who's now moved across to Kāinga Ora, I remember saying to her kind of 6 to 9 months in, what are we getting here? What is happening? You know, we haven't seen anything. That's money. It's only a small amount of money, but what are we getting from it? And then boom, about 2-3 weeks later, we were just like, oh, this is it. The richness, the learnings, the things we had no idea that we didn't know were just flooding in. So, there was some nervousness, I'm not going to lie. We were really, really lucky that we had really good support from our manager. And it was what I was talking about with Leilani earlier, that I'm based up in Auckland, I've got a team up here, the providers are up here, the ministry's down in Wellington, and so we were kind of off the radar a wee bit, to be honest. But our manager trusted us and trusted the process, and which gave us that flexibility and support to really lean in and give this a nudge. Like I said, for me, the connections that evolved from this work and the things that we didn't know were amazing. I mean, I saw Lofi there from MB online just before, and you know, we had no idea that they were in this space and that we could partner with them and that we could bring together and come up with an escalation pathway, or think about how our providers could work with their tenancy people on the ground. Habitat for Humanity is another example. Kind of knew who they were, knew they did some good work. Didn't know that 3 years later they'd be running Auckland's strongest curtain bank for us, and doing some amazing work for our whānau. And I guess my other big surprise and reflection looking back now is that we really did work with the willing, and it didn't matter your role, your rank, your title, who cares? It was finding someone who had a common goal, was interested in workarounds, and we just kind of drove forward from that. Some of the challenges, it was hard to get this contract across the line, to be honest. I think we bounced back and forth from our business board or funding board, whatever it was called at the time, about 3 or 4 times, because they were like, what are the outcomes? And we're kind of scratching our heads going, well, we don't really know what the outcomes are. We're not there yet. And it took, you know, and like I said, it was a small amount of money, but they were like, why? What are you going to get from this? So we really had to use our best influencing techniques in that one. There was a real tension between being whānau-led and sticking with the timelines, contract deliverables. And I'm particularly feeling that now. I felt it with the HHI one, but we've got a large rheumatic fever co-design happening in Auckland at the moment. And I just spoke to the project manager yesterday, and she said, Bronwyn, I'm really feeling the tension between you and Nikki and the ministers, and about the accountability for this work, and some of the things that Debbie just mentioned about the time and the freedom to actually learn and grow. So that is just an ongoing tension that I think we need to be able to document and articulate, but be relatively uncomfortable with. For me, in the housing space, the intervening for whānau already experiencing significant adversity and stresses was really high stakes, and the need to tread really carefully. And you know, that was delicate, and some of our whānau was so brave, especially when it came to kind of confronting landlords around some things, and that knife edge around, you know, whether they'd have a home and things like that. So it was a really delicate real life balance, I guess. And it wasn't always easy to hear the whānau experience it and be willing to escalate those issues to other government agencies. You know, one of them is just hearing some of it and the lived reality of some of our whānau, and then being able to ring up and say, actually, mate, this isn't working. You need to think about a different way to approach it. And I think we've had some big successes in that space from the co-design and the broader Healthy Homes Initiative, with many of the government agencies we've been lucky to work with. Causes of poor housing and poor health outcomes are complex and interrelated, not surprisingly, and collaboration and partnership was the key. And I think the co-design work really put that in the forefront of our minds. And for me, one of the biggest challenges, and I kind of alluded to it before, was the influencing the big system change. And I'm not sure who said it earlier, maybe Leilani, I could be wrong, but really looking at ourselves and not looking for you know, not putting our solutions on others and communities, but looking at the systems that we have set up, whether that's around how we commission or contract or whatever it might be. And I'm having an awkward conversation with HUD and others about emergency and transitional housing this afternoon, and I feel like it's another good example of how that plays out. But this co-design work really did have an influence, especially around things like the Healthy Homes Guarantee Act, where I learned things about curtains that I never knew and that our providers never knew, and then they could advocate for some of these things in the Healthy Homes Guarantee Act and others. So look, I've talked really quickly, but in summary, co-design can and does feel really uncomfortable at times, and I think you just got to learn to embrace that to a degree. You got to embrace that safe to fail approach and different ways of working, and that's really awesome when you hit that sweet spot. Buy-in from above and surrounding is really critical, and the willingness to share power, genuinely share power and create really true relationships. And I think co-design is really, really well worth it. And I encourage you all, when the time is right and where you can, to give it a nudge.
Bronwyn, thank you so much. That's a wonderful story of honesty and difficulties, but the absolute ability to overcome them. So that's just what we're interested in. Thank you so much. And I think you actually underestimate the impact that you've had as creating the conditions in a big ministry and being the enabler. So yes, you're underestimating the importance of your impact, and that's really relevant for our audience. Thank you so much. Do remember, we've got a good long Q&A time, about half an hour, we hope a little bit later, so there'll be a chance. Get your questions in to Bronwyn and to the others, and we'll be able to take them up in the Q&A. And now I move on to very warmly welcoming Tamsin, who will, I think, introduce herself and her topic. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Shenagh. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Primrose Hill te maunga, ko London Thames te awa, ko Evans toku hapu. He Pākehā hau I weke oku tūpuna I Waihongi a Piri tēnei. Ka ora oku marae, he tangata tiritia hau. Ko Liz toku whaia, ko John toku mātua, ko Tamsin hau. Ko te tahi o ngā paumataho o te Manatū Taonga. London toku tūranga waiwai, ke pai kakariki toku kāinga I Nāia nei. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So kia ora everyone, I'm Tamsin Evans. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive for the Delivery Group at Manatū Taonga, Ministry for Culture and Heritage. Very much like Bronwyn, I'm not an expert, but what I am going to talk to you about is our experiences of a couple of projects where we've worked alongside communities and tangata whenua in ways that were quite new for some of the ministry. So I guess the first thing I would observe is that working with communities it's really not too hard once you get into it, and nothing to be worried about, and it can even be fun. And I guess echoing a point from others I've heard this morning, if we're working with colleagues inside our own organisation or in another agency, and together you manage to achieve something more than you could have done on your own, we commend ourselves for our teamwork and our collaboration. So let's embrace that. In 2019, Manatū Taonga delivered a major national commemoration called Tuia 250. Some of you might remember it, and some of you won't even have heard of it. But the energy it generated in communities and amongst waka haurua was fabulous. We're very comfortable in the space around the government side of organising something and delivering it as big as that. We worked with about a dozen government departments and agencies, from the Ministry of Education to Te Arawhiti, DIA, to even the New Zealand Space Agency. And we worked with the British High Commission, the Governor General and the Tahiti government. So happy space for public servants. But it was the biggest single event we'd ever delivered working with communities, and the scope crept and totally outgrew our capability. And it was pretty obvious we were going to have to move into being a supporter and a partner, and not being the main show on our own. And that was a bit of a challenge for many of my colleagues who had to sit in that uncomfortable space and let communities and tangata whenua take a lead. It certainly wasn't a smooth ride, but hindsight shows it's part of what's helped us as a ministry get to where we are now, establishing a new strategic framework and organising our whare o Manatū Taonga towards a goal of becoming an exemplar Te Tiriti o Waitangi partner. So very quickly, a bit of detail. Tuia Encounters 250 was a commemoration marking 250 years since the first onshore encounters between Māori and Pākehā, when the Endeavour and James Cook and his crew arrived in 1769. More than that, it was a celebration of our Pacific voyaging heritage and a national opportunity to hold some really honest conversations about the past, the present, and how we navigate our shared future. It was big. It was really big. 3 months, 15 waka ships and Navy vessels took part in the various flotilla and pohiri. 400 crew members participated, 5,000 sail trainees got an opportunity, 40,000 people visited the vessels on the open days. Yeah, I could go on. I could wax lyrical for a long time. But in the waka haurua context, which is what I really want to talk about, the Tuia voyage exposed a lot of New Zealanders to waka culture and history and how much it's a huge part of our collective heritage. And it has left a legacy for generations to come. And we hope the concept of weaving people together will help us in our lead up to the 200th anniversary of Te Tirihia Waitangi in 2040. So once we'd finished the voyage, it was a bit of thinking about what's next. And the Prime Minister had announced at Mahia a week before Christmas during the closing ceremony of Tuia that she wanted to see a strategy to make the waka haurua kaupapa more sustainable. That became permission to submit a late budget bid, which suddenly became an urgent cabinet paper needed in 72 hours, which became an announcement at Waitangi on Waitangi Day of 1.5 million over 2 years to develop a strategy to make kaupapa waka haurua sustainable and to support some of the voyaging events and activities to keep the waka in the public eye and accessible to communities. Fantastic news. Despite the benefit of our experience with Tuia, Manatū Taonga went into default mode and tried to run this as an MCH project. We tried and tried and tried to make it fit the standard mold, created project plans, budgets, and so on, reworked it many, many times over and over, but we couldn't get it right. Then COVID-19 came along, and that put a stop to things for 9 months. The waka haurua were dispersed, the whānau we needed to work with were dispersed, and everybody had other priorities. But we picked up the mahi late 2020 and took the opportunity to do things differently. We were really explicit that the beneficiaries of the strategy, that thing we've been funded for, won't be the government, so why would we try and make it a government project? We picked up a different methodology in December and set up a wayfinding wānanga to build the framework of the strategy. The concepts around island of success and island of doom were so much easier to visualize and verbalize than critical success factors and risk identification and mitigation planning. From there, we've set up an interim board to lead the work, 3 of the waka leaders, 2 rangatahi representatives, and 1 Manatū Taonga rep. To create an entity to lead this work that is separate from and able to operate independently of Manatū Taonga, we had to resolve all sorts of barriers around procurement policies and practices, unorthodox governance structures, the cabinet fees framework, delegating authority outside the entity, the organization, legal structures, defining boundaries between responsibility and accountability, working with poorly resourced organizations, balancing risks, and then navigating our way through our own policies and systems to really be able to shift the power from the ministry to the community. So a few observations on why this partnership and co-design approach is working for us. Tuia was a one-off. We didn't have a template. We had no prior experience. And so it was an opportunity to make a difference and do things differently. In that case, it meant government supporting communities to host the flotilla, to host the cruise, and quite different from the original intent of a government-led national commemoration. It grew, and we had to adapt and do what was needed to make it a success because expectations had also grown similarly. Being led by mana whenua and community made each stop on the voyage amongst the communities very much of its place, so a huge amount of community ownership, and a long way from that cookie cutter Wellington approach we might have had otherwise. We had incredible champions in our co-chairs, Hotoro Barclay-Kerr and Dame Jenny Shipley. Both of them were prepared to really put their mana on the line, and visually as well and culturally, they embodied the kaupapa of the dual heritage and the shared future, which was a really powerful speaking tool. Phase 2, if you like, Te Hau Komaru is going well because we've got a working relationship built on the success of Tuia. We've got the trust and confidence and familiarity with each other. And inside Manatū Taonga, we've recognized that we're the ones with the capability and the capacity and perhaps that moral responsibility to carry many of the risks. The board members are accountable to their own communities, whānau and iwi, which is a very powerful driver for them. The waka leaders are driving the kaupapa, consulting with their communities, developing the strategy, building new programs. For example, we now have a national Waka Haurua festival. The first one was held in May with a fabulous 6-week lead time to deliver it. And so what the government is bringing, Manatū Taonga provides the supporting infrastructure, the budget, the connections to ministers and cabinet and government, and keeps the machinery side ticking, allowing the waka whānau and the leaders to focus on the kaupapa. We're on track, I think, to get the board to establish itself independently next year as a national body. And our goal is that we'll be in a position where the balance of the 1.5 million can be transferred across to that body as seed funding. So quickly, I think co-design needs trust, honesty, humility, pragmatism, and flexibility, and above all, a willingness and a determination to work to get the outcome everyone wants. I reckon there really is a mood for change in Aotearoa, and we're obliged to be at the forefront in the public sector, but nothing will change unless we do things differently, and we have to get used to being a bit uncomfortable because it's the way we do things now. And just a note on waka, the pictures there. Some of you may recognize Taheka Nukamai Busby, Hector Busby, who's the man responsible for bringing the waka and navigation kaupapa back from the brink of extinction in Aotearoa. So let's not forget that by understanding our past, we can chart a really better, stronger, more determined course for our future. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tamsin, thank you so much. That's so refreshing and a story that I think is not widely known. And you've got so many gems in there for us to take away. So bearing that in mind, just take a brief pause, just a minute, and just think these questions. What are people doing to grow the conditions for these ways of working? I think you find lots of things to think about. Just 1 minute and we'll come back and go into the breakout groups. Thank you. It's not too late to put your questions through to chat, so don't hesitate to get your comments through. And we'll pick them up the best way we have. We already have some, so we can put some questions. Great. We have Bronwyn and Tamsin, just Debbie to come on. Right, here we are. We're ready for you. And I will be picking on questions that have come up directly onto the chat today, things that have come on other days and other things. I thought we might start though with this one that's come up a lot, and you mentioned it, Bronwyn, the influencing skills. Just talk to us a bit, both of you and all of you, about what seems to work. What did you do? How did you make it work?
Shall I kick off?
Yeah.
I fear that my influencing skills have rubbed off on my 9-year-old daughter, who seems to be using them back against me. So I don't know if it's a good thing or not, but anyway. Look, I think for me, my approach is relationships. And, you know, I've heard some people say, oh, collaboration is really hard. And I'm like, no, it's not. Pick up the phone, have a conversation, you know. And so my general approach to work and relationships and influencing is people, be honest and genuine about if you're in a predicament or if you need something or what that could be, but be genuine about it. And, you know, champions. I think for me in my influencing, I don't think I've been, you know, horrible about it, but I've been quite strategic about finding champions for this work. and continuing those relationships with them right the way through. And those people then become champions and allies in other ways as well. But for me, the influencing thing comes a lot down to storytelling and impact. And, you know, one of the stories I didn't get to, but one of the stories about the HHI and the co-design work was a provider going in to a whānau and wanting to talk to them about their cold, mouldy, damp home. But this mother with her children was having mental health issues. It was completely the wrong time. And so they journeyed with the whānau and then came back. And 3 months later, they could say, look, can we do something about your house? And for me, it's those gems that really speak to the issue and kind of the reality of things that helps get people on board. I mean, you can't help but hear that story and think, shivers. You know, the way we've set things up doesn't help. So yeah, storytelling, relationships, champions, and just picking up the phone, really.
Okay. Tamsin, you seem to have a number of workarounds, which I think I'd call influence. So can you talk a little bit about from your experience?
I think I might have abused a little bit of positional influence because I'm lucky that I'm sitting at that tier 2 in a small ministry. So an easy direct relationship with the chief executive and a bit of authority around some things, but that doesn't mean you can get things past the legal team, to be honest. So some of it was about being creative, and yes, as Bronwyn was just saying, being prepared to talk it through. You know, just because that's the way it is, can we do it differently? Can we look at this from another point of view? And just really working with the people side of it rather than the structure side. Because if we can work on building champions inside the business as well as our sort of, you know, high level, big public champions, then we've got an opportunity to change things over time inside the machine. So yeah, we work around procurement rules, contracts, delegation of financial authority, all sorts of things. And it wasn't easy, and it took a lot of time, but we've got, if we can, you know, keep the waka afloat right through to the point where it's off on its own voyage, then we'll have some really good structures that we can use again. So
thank you. There is a question specifically to you, Tamsin. I deduced from your presentation that co-design happened by accident, last resort. Interested to know if the ministry is now progressing co-design as the default and making organisational changes to enable this.
A bit of yes and no to both of those, actually. I had always wanted to go down the co-design path with Te Haukomaru, the second phase. But we were a bit driven by the processes outside the ministry around how we started that. And actually COVID was, you know, the gift of time for us, really, let time elapse and, you know, new top priorities so we could focus on it. And that approach of using a wayfinding methodology rather than a project planning was really part of that. We have, I don't think we're in a co-designer's default at the moment, but certainly through the cultural recovery packages, there was quite a lot of investment in arts, culture and heritage from the government for the COVID response. And we have definitely gone into a co-design mode around some of the new contestable funds that are in that space. So
thank you. Yeah. Let's, I'll ask Debbie, perhaps if you'd be able to answer this one. It's come up from people. How do we honour the primacy of the treaty relationship in amongst the broader relationships and power sharing required as part of a true co-design approach?
Kia ora. I think we just do that. Like, we have to, as Crown agents, be able to provide, I guess, understand the rationale of why we're doing that and bring it into our co-design kaupapa. So, but I mean, obviously it depends where you're co-designing, who you're co-designing with, but the treaty is a key part of design kaupapa, and most likely always with Māori if you're co-designing with Māori. Yeah, some of the other speakers might have something else to say to that.
Yeah, does anybody want to add anything to that? There's another question which is about views of Te Tiriti within co-design. Specifically, they actually said about Crown bodies who don't have it as part of their legislation. But Bronwyn, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I would probably say that if we were about to do the HHI co-design now, again, kicking off, we would probably do it with a stronger Tiriti focus. This was kind of 2015, and although I think it was there, it wasn't as explicit as it could have been. I would say that the flexibility and the freedom we gave the providers, and we gave TSI in that space, meant that what we got had a strong focus on Tiriti. But from a Crown agency perspective, I think we could have been more explicit about those things from, looking back now and thinking about where we are. So I guess that's something that I know is being built into the rheumatic fever co-design that's currently underway. And what's even more exciting about that, and kind of linked with Tiriti, but not really, more around equity, is we're taking a Māori, Tongan and Samoan focus. So we haven't even clumped Pacific together. And I'm terribly excited to see and understand what comes from that. So learning, that constant learning is, front and centre.
Thank you. Tamsin, I think you wanted to add something.
I was just going to add that, we would probably be more explicit about a Te Tiriti focus. But I do think the fact that we have now a couple of successful examples of that level of engagement, it is part of the shift inside the ministry around our strategic framework about putting Te Tiriti right at the heart and centre of what we do. We're going to be forever working out what that means and what it looks like. But that's, I guess, organisational learning.
Thank you. Let's move on to something that's come up a lot and that you mentioned, Bronwyn, which is how within the public service we can carve out the sort of time that's needed to do this work authentically.
Yeah, I'll have a crack and then pass over to the others.
Yeah.
I guess the way we did it with the Healthy Homes co-design work was we kept up our BAU. So we made sure everyone was happy with the BAU that was trudging along, and tried to just carve out as much time as we could to put in this. And as I said right at the outset, I wasn't doing the heavy lifting in this. So I was just kind of trying to, they talk about lawnmower parents these days, trying to move obstacles out of the way.
You shouldn't underestimate the power of that, Bronwyn.
Yes,
really.
I know, but that's what I felt like I was doing. But in order, from my manager's perspective, I was doing my normal mahi well, that she was giving. And because of that, we'd built her trust to enable us to have more bandwidth around carving out the proper time for this. But it's definitely not a 9 to 5 kind of gig when you're in it, when you're heavy in it. You're taking phone calls on the way back from the airport or in the evening or the weekend, because when you get knee deep in this, it's so intense and so meaningful that it doesn't finish at 5 o'clock on a Friday.
Tamsin and Debbie. Tamsin?
I took all of that, and in the planning around these initiatives, think about more than 1 year for budget, because you will need the time. Don't try and do everything in one financial year.
Debbie, anything you want to add about the management of time?
I think it helps to think about evaluation and reflection through, as an evaluator, I can say this, through your project. So that can also give you the time to reflect on how things are going and how to adapt and be agile. So time for reflection is important to include in your project plans, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's just move on to a slightly different but very interesting view, which has been put by people who are writing in. Thank you so much for putting in all your questions. We're really reading them and noticing them. The question is, how do we change the emphasis on measuring hard, tangible outcomes to measuring the process and the relationship benefits? if the change is in the process of how we work, then how can that be focused outcome that aligns with Treasury funding? And this relates to the point made earlier of the value, not just of the outcomes, but of the process. So it's a big question, but have a go. Who'd like to start?
I can start with that one.
Okay, Debbie.
Really, I think it's important to, at the beginning again of your project, to think about how you're evaluating it through and to include those measures of process into your evaluation plans. So you actually include them, think about them at the beginning. What does good process look like? And I mean, if you reflect on the framework I shared, for example, what does good co-design look like for Māori? That's just one view, but you could also co-design the measures of what that looks like within your project with your partners and participants. So that's what I would recommend.
Great.
Yeah.
Tamsin?
Complicated question.
Yes.
I think it helps to separate, the co-design activity that you're doing and then the outcomes that come from that. So yeah, we'll change process to make the machinery work, but the outcome is further down the track. So in terms of that measuring the process, have we got a good contract in place? Yes, tick. Have we got a contract everybody signed willingly because they understand it? Yes. So that's that more outcome evaluation. But what really matters is, is this co-design activity going to deliver the longer term outcome that we want?
Like an intervention logic of some sort, but you value the processes. Yeah. Bronwyn.
Yeah, I would say that in some areas we're still moving from outputs to outcomes, to be honest. And that is still a journey, and lots of people talk about outcomes, but they're actually talking about outputs. And often when we talk about outcomes, we define them ourselves as opposed to them being genuine outcomes for whānau and communities. But I agree with some of the comments just made. Reflection is a big one. And and I'm kind of grappling with this at the moment. It can't just be about evaluating the prototypes. It's got to be about that bigger picture. And for me, that bigger picture is so important around capability and future capability. And instead of us doing this amazing bit of co-design work and us holding it here, we have to think about how we share that story and our experience, the good, the bad and the ugly, so that someone who's sitting on the desk behind me in the Disability Directorate or over in Breastcarine Aotearoa go, oh God, I've heard about this. Should we give it a nudge? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How do we go about it?
Yeah.
So we've got to be able to do both, and honestly, I guess, as well.
That's wonderful. And you said about something I noted down, that you realized somebody was doing something that you just discovered. And we do have a question about this, actually. Really nice question. How can we set up a system so that we can all, across government agencies, understand what each other is doing in the space of co-design with Māori, so we can find connection and share knowledge, etc.? That is such an important follow-up question. So how are we going to do that? I've got Tamsin and Bronwyn both without their microphones on, so one of you can jump in.
Tamsin, you go first.
Well, I think we're doing it right now. And to echo what Bronwyn said earlier, just pick up the phone, talk to each other, and maybe this becomes something IPANZ can facilitate on an annual basis, promoting case studies, and being willing to share. So it does go a bit to that culture about being prepared to fail, and being prepared to talk about the gnarly, nasty bits as well as the happy, engaging, very photogenic bits. So talk to each other.
You've done that so beautifully today. You've done that beautifully. And I absolutely take the challenge to IPANZ to keep sharing and spreading the knowledge. I absolutely take that challenge. Debbie, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I noted someone had mentioned Te Arawhiti, the Crown Māori Relations group. And I think that that's an important group to be connecting with, and possibly they are already logging, a lot of work that's going on in government collaboratively. I did want to mention that their definitions and that they've developed for partnership and co-design are actually there on their website, and they clearly talk about shared decision making as what co-design is. Yeah. So go to the website and find out what's happening and what they're doing as well across government.
Thank you very much. We're very anal about time, and I'm looking that I've got another 4 minutes. Is that right, Penny? Look, so in 4 minutes, I actually would like to pick up something that came up before, is how do you look after yourselves in doing this work? You've talked about, how often you have to hold things. Leilani talked about it too, how she needed to take care of herself and her team. I just think it's an important thing to think about. How do you take care of yourself doing this, well, out there mahi? Bronwyn, from Ministry of Health, you should know this.
Yeah, well, I should, shouldn't I? The simple stuff around eating well, sleeping, work-life balance and all that kind of stuff. But for me, there's three kind of things. I try and keep as much perspective and presence as possible. And so when I finish my day and get to go home to my lovely children, trying to be really present with them. And I think that's really important in terms of whatever fills your cup up, making sure you do enough of that. Yeah. And I guess the other thing is laughing, fun, good team, and celebrating those successes when they come. And, it may be, like I said, a really small success. It could be one of the transactional things about getting a contract across the line, which then enables the freedom around that, but really celebrating the successes when they come and just bearing down during those tough times and then knowing that back up again.
Tamsin?
Yep, much the same. I have the luxury of the world's best commuter journey on the train between Wellington and Pākehā, so I'm pretty strict about using that time to separate work and home, both in the morning and in the evenings. So I try not to work at home unless I have to, but you can't stop the phone ringing. So you have to be quite tough about that at times in terms of, no, this is not the time to take that call, as long as you return the call. So it's about being a bit disciplined, I think, and yeah, enjoy the little things, whether that's in your own life or yes, the signing the contract, the paying the invoice. Yeah.
And you take responsibility, I know, too, for building the capability in others, in your colleagues and in your seniors. So there's a lot to be done, but it's really worthwhile. Debbie, do you want to add anything?
Yes, well, I think drawing on your people is really important. And AJ talked about the tribe, having your tribe there. And so, and your people could be your ancestors, your family, your friends, your colleagues, your group at work. It's really important because as an evaluator who sees lots of different grassroots kind of organisations, and government organisations at the grassroots, the frustration and the work is really hard out there, and we see a lot of it, and we do feel for the people right on the front line. So we always want to support wellbeing as well. So yeah, I think drawing on your people is really important.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We're coming to the end of the panel. I suspect you underestimate the impact of what you've managed to do today. I'm very moved by it. It makes me very hopeful that the public sector really, really can get there and learn different ways of being, knowing and doing. So I'd like to thank you very much indeed, all of you. And this will not be the end. Thank you. Okay. All of you guys, this is the final reflection time. So it's just your opportunity to stop for a minute. What can I or we, as your team, start paying attention to and remembering what Mataroa said, what might be my first step from here? So just think about that, perhaps for 2 or 3 minutes, because it's quite a big question. We will move on then to do a Slido, and we do collect all of your comments and we do reflect on them and we'll use them ongoing. After we've got all your ideas on Slido and we've put them up on the screen, I will then briefly talk about what happens next, and I will thank a few people, and then we'll go to Debbie with her messages at the end of the day so that we finish this as we started, and then Anton will complete with the karakia. So I'm going to leave this final reflection with you now for 3 minutes. So I just want to finish with some thanks, and some very, very heartfelt thanks, above all to our speakers, and some of them are still here, but all of them, they have been wonderful. They've told us that this is possible and that it's exciting and that it can happen. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I also want to thank the team. I mean, for IPANZ, this has been an amazing experience. I think you can see what an extraordinarily participatory, immersive, reflective process that Penny and Gleisner and Debbie and Robyn have created for all of us. And I'm in awe of it. I'm definitely in awe too of the technology. I would like to thank Baruch and Lee and Kim for their support. Thank you very much indeed. Let's not forget Della and Fiona in the IPANZ office, who've done lots of work behind the scenes too. I've said 2 thank yous, but I haven't yet said probably the most important thank you, which is to you as participants. I mean, you've been incredibly engaged. You've brought a lot of wisdom. You've given us a lot of support. You don't know what it's like when you're on the end of a screen, and you probably do know what it's like on the end of the screen, and you get the affirmative comments and the participation of you. Thank you so much. I just want to say a quick word about the IPANZ commitment for now. And I know that you know that we could never have done this without the expertise of Penny, Debbie, Robyn, and others. And I do actually want to acknowledge Robyn and Alan and Clarke, who have sponsored this. Thank you so much. But we need to take it further. And the sorts of things we're thinking about from IPAN's point of view is we'd always welcome your ideas. You can email us anytime. We'll take up your ideas. We will write our own summary and continue the conversation through our journal and through our e-updates for the wider IPANZ audience, which is a very wide audience. And we will also consider ways of perhaps informing our seniors. I think at the beginning I said 3 little tips. Give this time, see yourself as a change agent, and persuade your seniors. I think that's actually a bit of a message for IPANZ. We'll take on those 3 points. Our goal is to inform and inspire our members. I really do think that this has been both informative and inspiring. So remember, the expertise lies with the others. It may be that you want to contact them. We will make sure that their details are available for you. Keep in touch with us, ask us what you want to know, and we'll get back to it. We're a very small staff. I think we're only 2.5 full-time equivalents, but we will get back to you. I think I'll leave it there. No reira, teina katoa. Thank you so much. And I'd like to hand over to Debbie.
Everyone, we're just about to close, and I just want to also say thank you very much for participating. It's been a real privilege to be able to speak into the government sector as an evaluator myself. I recognise that it's the mutu whenua phase of the moon at the moment, so we're coming down to almost to the new moon, and that phase is about contemplation and closing down. So it's a good time to be in this space where we can kind of contemplate on what we've learned for the last 3 days. And a kōrero around that is a quote that sometimes more can be seen in the darkness. So hopefully for those that are still in the dark a little about how they might go forward, I think just it's an encouragement that you may actually see something. So sometimes more can be seen in the darkness, is something that I'd like to leave you with. But just reflecting on some of the great things that we've heard over the symposium. We called this symposium Co-Design in Aotearoa, Knowing, Being and Doing. And we did that purposefully so that we could actually address the real need to ensure that the ways that we work are going to make change. And that's, I guess, the belief behind this kaupapa. So what are some of the things that we've heard? Well, in terms of being, we've heard about being in relationship is a key thing. Making the time for relationship or to be in relationship. We've heard about being authentic, honest and trustworthy. We've heard about being humble and vulnerable. We've heard about being the leader for change, being tika, pono and aroha, being the values that we aspire to. So actually being those things. We've also heard about knowing. What have we heard about knowing? Well, some of the things I thought about here were, we've learned a little bit about what the roles government might take in a co-design space, the roles of tautoko, for example. We've heard about different paradigms and where we might come from. We may have learned more about those paradigms and how that impacts the work that we do. And what have we learnt about doing? There's been lots of learning, I think, about doing, and we've had some great whakaaro today about some of the practical things about doing. We've learned about engaging, respecting, and listening is a key thing as well. Being supportive, creating space, creating safe space, and also creating the systems or helping to create the systems and advocate in the systems for change. We've heard about being committed to the kaupapa. So these are just some of our last thoughts that I have about our symposium to take away. And I would just like to leave it there and welcome Anton back to close our symposium for the duration that we've had. Thanks, Anton. And Anton might share some whakaaro before we go too. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Debbie. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge a few people and echo Shenagh's thanks to everybody who's been involved in bringing the wānanga together. It's been an awesome 3 days. I particularly want to thank the kaimahi, the people who came along and shared their kōrero, their knowledge and experiences. What a wonderful bunch of storytellers you all are. I've added so much to my kete over the last 3 days, which is really exciting, but it also reminds me about how much more room there is in there and how much more I still have to learn. So I'm looking forward to the fact that there might be more of these kind of events in the future. Desna, I wanted to share with you that I have mentor envy. It was just so awesome to listen to Carl and all of the wisdom that he shared, but and in particular the whakapapa that he shared for us about co-design in Aotearoa. I just thought that was a really useful sort of way to ground us and understand a little bit about our history, where we are, and perhaps highlight some of the pathways that are available to us as we move forward on our journeys. Debbie, Desna, Penny, Shenagh and Robyn, thank you also very much for what I can only describe as a wonderfully curated wānanga. Fantastic kaupapa, just beautifully themed and really deftly facilitated. Like I say, I'm coming away from this event with lots of learnings, inspiration, food for thought, and those are the three really precious gifts. So I thank you all very much for those. I also wanted to share with you a few of my reflections on the 3 days. And I thought before the event, I knew a little bit about space. I've come to realize that my knowledge was pretty limited, but I'm just really captivated by that concept and all of the nuance around it that I've learned about. The notion and idea of creating space, of holding space, of making it safe, of collapsing it, of how you go about inviting and welcoming others into the space, understanding the space, positional elements, nurturing the tikanga and the kawa for the space, and how you share space, including the power dynamics in that space. So just lots of rich stuff in there. Also today, I really enjoyed the conversations around influence. And as we look forward, I'm really encouraged, and I took a lot out of the different ways of influencing as well, helping others to be brave. I thought that was a fantastic concept today, finding and using champions. And another beautiful one from today, which was around about finding a tribe. But the last one that I wanted to share with you that I think is really important, and again, I've really enjoyed the experience of this week, is around being storytellers and sharing our stories, experiences, our lessons and successes. So yeah, really enjoyed that. I guess coming back to the kaupapa itself for the symposium, the being, knowing and doing. And I think my reflections, which I imagine will be ongoing for quite some time, I've come back to the notion of being. And what I took out of really strongly for me out of the last 3 days is some of the being things. And I thought the being present, so the idea of checking your business persona at the door, being in the moment, leaving all the other busy distractions of the world behind, being humble, being authentic, and being reminded about a simple thing by Whā Mataroa, which was around being yourself, which took me back to the value session that Penny hosted for us on day 1. And the values that I was interested in, or that I included in our Slido, were around whanaungatanga, manaakitanga, katiakitanga, and mana tupuna, which is about being a good ancestor and honouring those from the past and preparing things for the future as well. So good reminders to ground ourselves in those values and bring those to our mahi. So that was fantastic. In terms of my first step from here, later today I'll head off to a hapuhui where for the weekend, where one of the kaupapa is about our rautaki, our strategy. And I'll go to that very blessed with lots of ideas that I'll potentially have the opportunity to share. Some of those which I'm borrowing from whānau, whānui or papakura. So thank you, Ange, and others. But I'm also taking the mindset with me of the importance of starting with whakarongo. And that's one of the key reminders, I guess, and lessons that I'm taking away from the week. The whakatauki that I'd like to share with you today is significant to me because kahikatea is a really prevalent and significant tree in where I'm from. And this whakatauki talks about standing together. Where I'm from, just out of Foxton, there is a whenua called Tāwaho, and it's famous for a large stand of kahikatea that were used for centuries by navigators making their way up and down the west coast of the North Island. It's a landmark that they could see from a long way out to sea. And it talks about how stands of kahikatea grow together, how their roots intertwine with each other, and how they help make each other strong. E tū kahikatea, he wakapai ururo, awhi mai, awhi atu, tātou, tātou e. Good luck to you all with your respective journeys of being, knowing and doing. Ngā mihi o Matariki kia koutou.